Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so buckle up, everyone, because today we are diving deep, really deep, into something that I think is going to make you see the Cold War and maybe even the world today a bit differently.
Oh, I agree. I mean, it's one of those policies that sounds deceptively simple at first glance, but then just spirals out in all these different directions.
It's Eisenhower's new look defense policy.
Right, that's the one.
Okay, so to set the scene, we're talking about the early 1950s.
Right.
The Korean War has just wrapped up.
Yeah.
People are on edge about the Soviet Union, worried about communism spreading. And you've got Eisenhower, a war hero, stepping into the White House, promising strength, promising stability.
And a balanced budget.
Right. And that's what's so fascinating to me, this idea that he could be tough on communism while also, being fiscally responsible.
Well, he was very concerned about the economic impact of military spending. I mean, there's that famous quote of his, something like, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired, signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed.
Yeah, heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Not exactly the kind of rhetoric you expect from a Cold War president who's about to ramp up the military.
Right. But then he unveils the new look, and it's all about this new weapon, this new technology that, at least in theory, could provide a lot of bang for the buck.
Yeah.
Nuclear weapons.
Okay, so was this genius or was this terrifying?
Maybe a little bit of both. But to really get it, you have to understand the context. The Soviets now have the atomic bomb.
Right.
The Korean War had just shown the limits of conventional warfare. The U.S. was under pressure to project power globally, but also not bankrupt itself in the process.
So it sounds like Eisenhower was in a real bind here.
Oh, absolutely.
He had to find a way to be strong without breaking the bank, and he's got these incredibly powerful, incredibly dangerous new weapons at his disposal.
And that's where the new look comes in. The idea was that nuclear weapons weren't just weapons, they were deterrents.
Deterrence, scared the Soviets so badly that they wouldn't even think about messing with us.
Exactly. It was called massive retaliation.
Okay, I've heard that term before, but what did it actually mean in practice?
It meant that any Soviet aggression, no matter how big or small, would be met with overwhelming nuclear force. The idea was to make the cost of aggression so astronomically high that it would deter them from even considering it.
But wasn't that a huge gamble? I mean, threatening to unleash nuclear Armageddon over every little border skirmish?
It was incredibly risky, there's no doubt about that. But the thinking was that the sheer destructive power of these weapons would make war unthinkable for both sides. It led to this concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Yeah, where both the U.S. and the Soviet Union knew that a nuclear war would mean annihilation for everyone.
Okay, I get the logic, but it still seems pretty terrifying,
Right.
Like the whole world's holding its breath, hoping no one accidentally trips and sets the whole thing off.
Oh, absolutely. The anxiety of that era was palpable. But then you've got another layer to this Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. He starts talking about rolling back communism, not just containing it.
So on one hand, you have this terrifying but weirdly stable concept of MAD, and on the other hand, you've got this talk about actually pushing back against communism. How did those two ideas fit together?
Well, in reality, rollback was more of a rhetorical goal than a practical one. Actually, pushing the Soviets out of Eastern Europe was never really feasible.
Right.
But it signaled a shift away from Truman's more passive containment policy. The new look was about being proactive, being assertive.
So did that assertive stance actually lead to military action?
Yeah, and this is where things get even more complicated, more controversial. We'll need to dig into specific examples like what happened in Iran in '53, Guatemala in '54, to really see how those fit into this bigger picture.
Wait, those covert operations? They were part of the new look.
Absolutely. Those events really highlight the tricky ethics, the messy consequences of trying to fight communism in the shadows.
Okay, so we've got nuclear brinkmanship, we've got covert actions, we've got talk about rollback. This new look is anything but simple.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. We'll dive into those covert operations in detail when we come back.
This is getting good. Don't go anywhere.
We'll be right back.
So before we took a moment to gather our thoughts, we were getting into the whole covert action side of the new look.
Yeah, the stuff that doesn't make it into the textbooks quite as often.
Exactly. And we specifically mentioned Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954 as, key examples.
Right. Those are the ones that really highlight how this idea of rollback played out in practice.
Okay, so let's start with Iran. I mean,
Yeah.
what was going on there that made the U.S. decide to get involved in this, secretive, kind of manipulative way?
Well, in 1953, you have the Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. He's this democratically elected leader, and he decides to nationalize the Iranian oil industry.
Makes sense, right? Iran wanting to control its own resources.
Yeah, on the surface, it seems pretty reasonable.
Right.
But the Eisenhower administration, they saw it through this Cold War lens. They were terrified that this would open the door for the Soviet Union to gain influence in the region.
I see. So even though Mossadegh wasn't a communist himself, the fear was that he might, tilt towards the Soviets if it meant getting support for his policies.
That's exactly it. And you have to remember, oil was this incredibly valuable strategic asset, and the U.S. was absolutely determined to keep it out of Soviet hands.
Okay, that makes sense.
Mm.
But how did that fear actually translate into action?
Well, it led to a covert coup orchestrated by the CIA with the backing of British intelligence.
Wow, a coup. That's pretty serious stuff.
They used propaganda, bribery. They even had agents on the ground stirring up unrest and exploiting these existing tensions within Iranian society.
And it worked.
It did. They managed to remove Mossadegh from power and install the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who is much more, let's say, aligned with Western interests.
So very cloak and dagger, like something out of a spy movie.
Yeah.
But what about the long-term impact? Did this intervention actually achieve what the U.S. wanted?
Well, that's the really troubling part. The coup in Iran had these really profound, lasting consequences. I mean, it sowed the seeds of resentment towards the U.S. and the Shah, which ultimately led to the Iranian Revolution in 1979.
You're kidding. So the U.S. trying to prevent the spread of communism might have actually inadvertently paved the way for the Islamic Republic we know today.
Yeah, it's one of those historical ironies. It really highlights the unintended consequences of foreign intervention. Even when you start with these seemingly good intentions, interfering in another country's affairs can have these ripple effects that last for generations.
That's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to Guatemala in 1954. What was happening there that caught the attention of the U.S.?
Well, like Iran, the Guatemalan coup was driven by this Cold War logic, this fear that communism was going to spread to the Western Hemisphere.
Okay.
This time, the target was President Jacobo Arbenz, who had implemented land reforms that threatened the interests of a really powerful U.S. corporation, the United Fruit Company.
United Fruit Company, I've definitely heard of them.
Oh, yeah?
Weren't they like a huge banana producer or something?
Bananas, yeah, but they had extensive holdings in a lot of Central American countries, including Guatemala. I mean, they owned vast amounts of land. And Arbenz's reforms, well, they were aimed at redistributing some of that land to Guatemalan peasants.
So again, it seems like a move towards greater social equity within Guatemala, but the U.S. saw it as a threat to its interests.
Yeah, and this time the threat was sort of twofold. You had this fear of communism gaining a foothold in the region, but you also had the very real issue of American corporate interests being directly challenged.
So the lines between ideology and economics start to blur a bit here, right?
Oh, absolutely. And it's important to remember that the United Fruit Company had really close ties to the Eisenhower administration. John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, had actually worked for the law firm that represented United Fruit.
You're kidding.
Yeah. And his brother, Alan Dulles, who's the director of the CIA, he had also been involved with United Fruit in the past.
Wow, that's a pretty cozy relationship. Makes you wonder how much of the intervention was driven by, genuine Cold War fears versus protecting the profits of a powerful corporation.
It's tough to say for sure, and it's something historians still debate. But we do know that the CIA, under Alan Dulles, orchestrated a covert operation to overthrow Arbenz.
Another coup.
Yep. They trained and armed a small force of Guatemalan exiles, gave them air support, and used propaganda to undermine the Arbenz government.
And what happened?
It was successful. Arbenz was forced to resign, and a military junta took power, which pretty much marked the beginning of decades of civil war and instability in Guatemala.
So, like Iran, the intervention might have achieved that short-term goal, but it created a whole bunch of new problems in the process.
Yeah, and in the case of Guatemala, the U.S. continued to support these right-wing regimes that committed all sorts of human rights abuses, which, further entangled the U.S. in this really complex and bloody conflict.
Right. These two examples, Iran and Guatemala, they really show how this new look wasn't just about, abstract theories or geopolitical maneuvering. It had real-world consequences, often really devastating consequences for the people living in these countries.
Absolutely. And it raises these uncomfortable questions about the use of American power. Was it justified to intervene in these countries? even if it meant undermining democracy and supporting authoritarian regimes. Were the ends really justifying the means?
Yeah, tough questions. And it makes you wonder if this whole approach, this new look, with its emphasis on covert action, if it actually backfired in the long run.
Well, that's a debate that continues to this day.
It sounds like the new look was a bit of a mixed bag, to say the least.
That's a good way to put it. It had its successes, but it also had its share of failures and unintended consequences, which we're still dealing with today in many ways.
Right, and I think that's an important point to keep in mind as we move on to discuss the broader legacy of the new look and its impact on the world we live in today.
Absolutely, because the new look wasn't just some isolated policy. It really set the stage for how the U.S. approached national security for decades to come. And those choices, those decisions made back then, still have ripple effects that we're feeling today.
Okay, so let's dive into that legacy then. What are one of the key ways the new look continues to shape the world?
Well, one of the most obvious is the ongoing debate about nuclear proliferation. I mean, the new look, with its emphasis on nuclear deterrence, it really set the stage for the arms race that followed.
So we're still living in the shadow of those mushroom clouds, so to speak.
In a way, yes. I mean, we've managed to reduce the number of nuclear weapons, but the threat of nuclear war is still there, lurking in the background. And that's a direct legacy of the new look and the thinking that shaped it.
Right. And then there were the ethical dilemmas raised by those covert operations, those interventions in Iran and Guatemala. They really force us to ask some hard questions about the limits of American power and the responsibility that comes with it.
Exactly. I mean, how do you balance the need to protect national security with the responsibility to respect the sovereignty of other nations? How do you prevent unintended consequences? How do you ensure that your actions are actually making the world a safer place? These are questions that we're still struggling with today, and they're directly tied to the legacy of the new look.
It also makes you think about the whole issue of the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower himself warned about in his farewell address. Didn't the new look, with its reliance on a strong military, actually contribute to the growth of that complex?
It definitely played a role. The new look helped solidify this idea that a strong military was essential for maintaining U.S. global dominance, even if it meant spending huge amounts of money and sometimes cutting back on other priorities like social programs or infrastructure.
And are we still stuck in that mindset today? Is the new look still shaping how we allocate resources and prioritize national security?
I think in many ways, yes. We still have this tendency to see military strength as the primary measure of national power, and we often prioritize military spending over other investments. That's a legacy of the new look and the Cold War mentality that shaped it.
So it seems like the new look wasn't just this historical event that happened back in the 1950s. It's still with us today, shaping our worldview, our policies, our priorities.
I think that's a really insightful way to put it. The new look was a product of its time, but its impact has been far-reaching and long-lasting. It's a reminder that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's a living force that continues to shape our present and our future.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into Eisenhower's new look. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the origins of the policy to its lasting impact on global politics.
It's been a fascinating conversation, really digging into these complex issues.
Absolutely. And hopefully you, the listener, come away from this with a better understanding of this really pivotal moment in history and how it connects to the world we live in today.
It's all about making those connections, seeing how the past informs the present and shapes the future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Eisenhower's new look. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
Yeah.
So we've seen how Eisenhower's new look policy played out in the 1950s, this mix of nuclear deterrence, covert actions, alliances.
Right, a lot of moving parts for sure.
But what about the long-term consequences? I mean, are there echoes of the new look that we're still dealing with today?
Oh, absolutely. The new look, for all its complexities and contradictions, it really fundamentally changed how the U.S. approached national security, how it projected power on this global scale. And I think it's safe to say those changes, they continue to shape our world in all sorts of ways.
Like, give me an example.
Well, think about the debates that are still raging about nuclear proliferation, right? The new look, with this big emphasis on nuclear deterrence, it arguably set the stage for that arms race that followed.
So we're kind of still living under the shadow of those mushroom clouds, even all these years later.
In a way, yeah. I mean, we've managed to reduce the number of nuclear weapons, but that threat of nuclear war, even though it's receded, it hasn't gone away. And that's a direct legacy of the new look, that kind of thinking.
It's like the guard dog never really went away. We've managed to tame it a bit, but it's still there, watching.
Yeah, a good analogy. And then there are those ethical dilemmas we talked about earlier, the ones that came with those covert operations, those interventions in Iran and Guatemala. I mean, those really force us to ask hard questions about the limits of American power, the responsibility that goes along with it.
Exactly. Like, how do you balance national security with respecting other countries? How do you prevent these unintended consequences? How do you even know if what you're doing is actually making the world a safer place?
Those are the questions, and they're not easy ones. And they're all tied up with the legacy of the new look.
And it makes you think about that phrase military-industrial complex, which wasn't that something Eisenhower himself warned about?
It was, right? In his farewell address, no less.
And didn't the new look, I mean, with its reliance on this strong military, didn't it contribute to the growth of that very thing?
I think it definitely played a role, yeah. It kind of solidified this idea that military strength equals national power, and that maybe sometimes you have to spend big on the military, even if it means maybe cutting back on other important stuff, like social programs.
And are we still kind of stuck in that mindset today?
In a lot of ways, yeah. I mean, we still tend to think that a strong military is the measure of a country's power, and we often see that reflected in how we spend money and how we make decisions about national security.
So the new look wasn't just this, thing that happened way back when. It's still influencing how we see the world, how we act in it.
I think that's a good way to sum it up. It's a reminder that history, it doesn't just stay in the past. It shapes who we are, how we think, how we act today.
Definitely a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from the birth of the new look to its lasting impact on global politics.
Yeah, it's been a great discussion unpacking all these layers.
For sure. And hopefully you, the listener, you've come away from this deep dive with a better grasp of this moment in history and how it still resonates with us today.
It's about connecting the dots, seeing how the past shapes the present.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Eisenhower's new look. We'll be back soon with another exploration of the ideas that shape our world.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.